Berryman's bones. The boy drew a line in sand he could not cross with a stick he needed to beat back water's wave. He didn't get the chance. You're not the boss of him besides, old man. Get your feet off my cold, wet grave. There aren't enough trains to take the bones to their belonging. Set sail or help him put things right. You can't do both. I asked God to make my arms into maces and flail everything in sight. These days, God is a lonely bitch and won't do anything I ask. I take a seat somewhere near the river. The purpose of the skeleton is to hitch meat to. The purpose of the meat is not yet clear. John Berryman was an important mid-20th century American poet who, in his life, garnered many of the most important poetic prizes like the Pulitzer, the National Book Award, the National Books Critics Circle Award, and then took his life by jumping off a bridge in Minneapolis on January 7th, 1972, just 40 years ago last month. He's probably most famous for a sequence of poems called the Dream Songs, which I've usurped for this small sequence of poems, and in homage to him. There are 18-line poems. It's 3 stanzas of 6 lines each, with a very intricate little rhyme scheme. And so talk about obsession. Sort of, if you see the poems, you'll sort of see those little obsessive elements in them. A few years after that poem was published, I continued to think about Berryman and write more about him. And these next 2 poems I first read at a reading in New York City at a space called The Kitchen. And after that reading, a young woman came up to me and said, "I want those poems." It was a young woman who was just starting up a new magazine called Public Space. It's gone on to, I think, be one of the better literary magazines over the past decade. And these 2 poems appeared in that first issue of the Public Space. Berryman's brains. His brains was exceeding capricious, anxious, and corpuscular. Probably the river pickled them. Someone said to him, "You're wasting your genius." He smelled of cheap cologne. He was tickled pink and dead. One must be glad, same someone said, to be a part of life, nor sorry to endeavor to leave it, as one must. It is enough. One has to follow the heart wherever. It's certainly enough to bust one's pretty little head open. How then, he asked his constant companion, might a man go on like this, a slivered almond? That one sat back on his haunches, unmasked and ugly as get out. The blow to the head he sang, the lullaby he delivered. Berryman's break. You awfully think it's funny, laughing at the dead and buried. On the lam and loose, he had just enough silly money for a little booze before a many-storied swim into obtuse waters. What was he looking for? What did he find under the waves? Chattering tooths? A mistress to make him lonely and sore and tell him he misbehaves? Were these the truths he sought? Was he satisfied in the end? Well, after all the livelong strife, it was one last gaffe. He spoke no final words to the wind. To the water, he said, tell me how to live my life and make me laugh. Water sign. I left the water of the womb and didn't look back. Years later, I sweat like a spigot trying to dig deep enough to drink. Even come heavy rain, I lack the tongue to lick it up, to lap what's left of heaven's big sob story. I cut it off and wrung the spit into a sack I made out of an old lung. It was just a swig, not enough to drown a kitten or to summon speech. Rivers and lakes are dust, dry and brown. The oceans are gone. And even though land is infinite, I ditched the divining rod and head straight for the beach. The sun brands me to the bone in less than a minute. Someone finds a skull in the sand and hears the ocean in it.